Every so often in Unsung Heroes, we come across a vehicle which I'm really excited to talk about because they go way beyond being just crazy, and some of them are downright insane. Some of the ones that come to mind would include something like the Citroen PLR, for instance, which isn't inherently crazy in its purpose, but it's one of the craziest looking vehicles you could ever imagine. It looks like it was designed by a 10-year-old who just went crazy with a piece of paper and a pen, and yet it's completely practical in its purpose. And of course, to see why, you'll have to check out that episode. But this one is another one just like that. Now, unfortunately, this one didn't have the kind of success that something like the Citroen had at what it was purposed for. But the story behind this car and all of its troubles, and also in a very ironic way, some of its greatest achievements, in a very counterintuitive way sometimes, as you'll see through this video, make it most definitely worthy of a place in this series. And I would say this is probably one of the best vehicles of this entire series in terms of truly living up to what we want from cars in Unsung Heroes. These cars which were brilliant but fundamentally flawed in some way, or at least didn't get the chance to fully shine. Now, the car in question is known by a couple of different names depending on how you want to specifically phrase it, but basically it's the Adams Escort VSC Can-Am Special, sometimes known as the Pontoon Special. For pretty obvious reasons. When you see the car, you can certainly see that design. The driver is sitting way off to the side, you can barely even see an engine, and it's got this ultra flat, crazy looking body, which despite being a Can-Am car, actually has a kind of strange resemblance to something like an LMP 900 car, like the BMW V12 LMR, but much, much older. So what's the story here? Well, it's an American car, and it was designed by a chap called Herbert Adams. And in the late 50s, he started working at General Motors. He was designated as being the head of the Pontiac Special Projects Division, and you can actually thank him for the creation of the Trans Am in 1969. Now, ultimately, he left the Pontiac Special Projects Division in 1973 due to creative differences with Pontiac because it was in the middle of the fuel crisis in America. He wanted to make bigger, brasher, more attitude-driven cars, which is what the Trans Am is kind of known for, and his final one being the SD455, which even that he had to fight to get it produced. But he didn't like how restrained they were being due to the financial crisis. So they were looking at it from the typical business perspective, whereas he was looking at it from what we would want, the petrol head perspective. But unfortunately, those two things clashed, and he ended up leaving. Now, what he did after that is pretty cool, and this is where the Pontoon Special comes in, because he set up his own company, a small company called VSC, which is Very Special Engineering, which I think is just about the coolest name I've ever heard. It's simple, it's straight to the point, and it's not particularly fancy. Now, initially, he didn't enter the Can-Am. He actually developed kind of race/road variants of both the Firebird and the Chevy Camaro, and they became pretty legendary in their time and successful as well. He sold a number of them, but it still didn't fully allow him to pursue the kind of creativity that he wanted to put down. In effect, kind of a Jim Hall type guy, but not as famous. So what he did is he designed a car inspired by the relatively new discovery, thanks to, speaking of Jim Hall, companies like Chaparral and Lotus, which was the Venturi Tunnel. Now, of course, Lotus was one of the first to do it. Chaparral brought in the concept of downforce, and basically the Venturi Tunnel is a less mechanical but just as efficient approach to giving you downforce, basically in a similar way to the fan car, but without having fans at all. So no moving parts. Instead of that, you have channels and tunnels underneath the vehicle's body, which of course create a low pressure area. The faster you go, the more downforce you get. So very similar to the fan car, but without any actual moving parts. And of course, that principle is used even to this day, mostly in stuff like supercars. Like, for instance, if you look at the underside of a Salina 7 or a Ferrari Enzo, you'll see a similar kind of concept, usually leading into a diffuser at the back end. But his approach was very interesting, and I personally am a huge fan of it because he has a similar mentality that I do, and that is we might not succeed, but if we're gonna do something, we go all in. And that is exactly what he did, because the problem with Venturi tunnels is the inherent design of a car. you have to curve the Venturi tunnels around the cockpit, around the mechanicals, and kind of work it into the car's existing shape somehow. What he did was the exact opposite. He worked the driver around the Venturi tunnels and the engine as well. So instead of having the driver in the center, the engine behind him, as most Can-Am cars would, he put the driver on the extreme left-hand side of the car and put the engine, a 550 horsepower, 5-litre Chevy V8 with a 4-speed manual, over on the extreme right-hand side of the car. And in fact, the engine was also partially hanging out of the vehicle. One side of the cylinder banks were outside of the bodywork on a slight angle, which you would think could be good for cooling, but it didn't ultimately turn out that way, and we'll get to that probably in just a second. But basically the result of that was twofold. For one thing, the car had an insanely huge central Venturi tunnel, which did exactly what all Venturis would hope to achieve, and that is the perfect Venturi shape. Straight in the front, compress that air straight out the back, with no mechanicals, no cockpit to move around, just a perfect aerodynamic design. Plus, that also allows the car to have that extremely low center part on top, which of course gives it its distinctive look, along with, of course, the offset driver as well, which in turn helped the downforce even more so by channeling so much more air down the center of the car than pretty much any other race car would have, and of course in turn over the rear wing, which only adds even more to the downforce. Now that sounds like a pretty cool idea, but it's in Unsung Heroes, so temper your expectations, of course, because, and to me this is the coolest thing you can possibly imagine about this car, it ended up working so well that it failed, because the Pontoon Special produced so much downforce that it broke itself. It actually caused structural damage to the vehicle itself because it was producing such a massive amount of downforce from the Venturis alone, let alone the rear wing as well. And ultimately, although they did rework the body and the frame to support the car, make it more stiff structurally and stronger, it ended up also being heavier. In fact, heavier than much of the competition. But it still produced a massive amount of downforce, and you could argue it may have been probably producing nearly as much, if not more, downforce as something like a Chaparral fan car anyway, but just in a more conventional-ish sort of way. The problems didn't end there though, because unfortunately, due to the fact that aerodynamic designs and manipulating airflow was still a very young thing in the racing world, they didn't fully know how to harness it. And that wasn't the only problem, because every single driver who drove the Pontoon hated it. It was extremely unstable, inconsistent, and sometimes almost dangerous. Now, in its very first race, it actually started to shake its own bodywork off, and it had to be removed from the event with a black flag because of shedding bodywork all over the track. But that wasn't the only issue, because, as I said, with them manipulating the airflow, not fully understanding that kind of thing yet, it actually resulted in the car changing its handling signature from corner to corner. So in some corners, it would extremely oversteer and become very twitchy. In other corners, for no apparent reason, it would be very heavy and have a ton of understeer, and sometimes it would even rock back and forth on the straights, which isn't exactly ideal. And it's all because it was so aerodynamically unstable. So a brilliantly flawed concept, if ever there was one. Ultimately, and this is probably the saddest thing of all, the car was removed from racing. It suffered various other issues later on. It had some decent results. It got a 10th place and 8th place. It never really qualified above 15th though. So a mixed bag, mostly on the side of negative rather than positive results. And it was scrapped, which is such a shame. At least put this thing in a museum, because failures are just as important as wins, because you can fail 1,000 times at something and then get it right. That doesn't make the previous attempts worthless. And if anything, a car this radically different, so extreme, and in some ways brilliantly gifted with that colossal amount of downforce, it deserves to be talked about more. It deserves to be in a museum, and of course we can't change that now, but what we can do is talk about it like we are. So to me, this is pretty much the exact epitome of an unsung hero, and what a machine. What an incredible car. But that's it overall for this installment. Of course, you can click through here at the end to see all of the previous episodes, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.